First one is from Sakib, and the question is, what is the best way to capture the effectivity of a relationship in a many-to-many relationship? So, Michael, why don't you take that one to start with?
Right. So first of all, you find a lot of comments online how to do this with a load end date. So let's start with the anti-pattern, right? So there should be no timelines in the link itself other than the load date, and that's for the technical visualization. What we do is we use an effectivity satellite attached on a link to capture those either those business timers from the source or the one that you calculate in the business vault, or like a deleted date that we capture or calculate based on the physical existence or non-existence of the relationship in the source data set, essentially. So the standard pattern, effectivity satellite is not a special satellite or something. It's really a standard pattern that it's a standard satellite where we capture those timelines, and that's it more or less. The only challenge is typically to calculate the deleted date, to recognize the deletion in the source system, and that really depends on how the data gets being delivered, essentially.
Okay, so Nols, what problem is this solving for maybe for those in the audience who haven't been through the certification course? What's the challenge that means that effectivity satellites are needed?
We have a fundamental challenge with relationships in most implementations, in that the relationships are only hinted at. It's never properly actually described. So the relationships are neglected in a lot of business processes. So you get specific relationships like an event or something that may express itself as a relationship, and that's nicely described, and that's fantastic. But in general, most relationships are just hinted at. It's just a foreign key or some sort of reference to, oh, you may want to know that there's a relationship here, but it's never described really well in the design paradigms. So, third normal form, which sort of the traditional approach to operational design, does have the relationship in there that there is a set of foreign keys potentially, but that's it. You don't know when it started. You don't know when the relationship changes. You don't know when the relationship has been deleted, to which Michael has alluded to. So the effectivity satellite is basically a set of derived data. So it's a business vault citizen. It's derived data because it doesn't exist at source. And so this derived data is an attempt to describe what is otherwise a poorly described entity as far as the relationship is concerned. And the issue there is, or the technique is to design or designate a driving key. In other words, which of these business keys participating in the relationship remains stable enough to evaluate the change in relationship over time. But Sagib asked a very good question. What about if it's a truly many-to-many relationship? In other words, there's not a single driving or identifying business key in the relationship. It's a true many-to-many. You can't use a driving key construct in those cases, but you can still use a business rule. Now, the driving key is basically a type of business rule. The results are business vault citizens because they are derived, that doesn't exist at source. So if you have a more complex business rule to unpack this relationship and bring other factors into its calculation as to trying to figure out when these relationships started and ended and all the rest, that rule could be as complex or as simple as necessary to deliver on that outcome. So the effectivity satellite is just capturing the descriptive details of that relationship in case of a poorly described relationship, which unfortunately happens more often than not. So that's the sort of the up and down of the effectivity satellite. As Michael pointed out, the derived data loads and is historized like any other satellite, so there's no special thing there. The special thing about effectivity satellites is just where does it come from? And it needs some sort of business rule, either a driving key of some sort or a more complex business rule.
One comment on this one. So I know there's some articles out there where they discuss to apply or combine effectivity setters with driving key. But from my experience, to be honest, it's much easier. The thing is, when you introduce a driving key, you imply some business rule where you say, well, there's some precedence of some business key or something. But in Data Vault, all the links are M2N links, many-to-many links, right? So we don't have an M1 to M link or something, or 0 to, or some other cardinality essentially. So from that perspective, the only challenge when loading a effectivity settler is really to identify if a record has been deleted or not. And that might be a challenge depending on the source mechanism, but in many cases, to be honest, it's not. So think about this. When you have full loads in staging or in your data lake, for example, those those relationships which don't exist anymore in the staging area must have been deleted. That's maybe a bit naive in some source systems, but for the general, for reliable sources, it works actually. And then we just calculate set the load date of the run where we identify the deletion essentially as the deleted date. That's it. So I don't see a driving key problem here or a driving key issue here. So to me, it's also a hate-love. People who went to my training know that I hate the driving key, but I also love it when I need it. But here I don't need it. That's my experience essentially. So I wouldn't bring the driving key into the discussion typically. Yep.
But you need a business rule, whether it's a driving key or a different rule, or whether it's a comparison for delete detection or not. You need some sort of rule to derive what's missing. And I think the effectivity satellite's a good construct to capture what was otherwise missing from the relationship descriptors.
Yeah. Okay.
Fully agree.
Great. Well, that's good. I mean, and it would seem to me that the way Data Vault goes about managing relationships is so much more advanced than the traditional methods that we used. And and this is probably getting deep down into how we manage those relationships as they get a little bit more complicated. But the fact that we actually, within the Data Vault, describe those relationships and then capture the information around how the relationship evolves and progresses is, to me, it's one of the fundamental bits that we have. So. Okay, well, Saqib, thank you for that very interesting question.
If you look at other design philosophies, they either do not address the relationships or they lose them completely. So if you look at, for instance, the dimensional models, fantastic for where it's used as a slice and dice ad hoc reporting structure, brilliant for that. But it does lose the grain or the essence of what those relationships are. So that metadata, that understanding does disappear. And so it's one of those things where you're 100% spot on that the relationships being an explicit or a specific entity is the secret sauce to flexibility. And then that leads to a broader range of integration opportunities, etc., as we need to achieve for what a warehouse needs to do, the two jobs, right? Integration, both business key in facts and their time context.
Yeah. And what I also think is the effectivity settler on a link will help us essentially to capture all the changes to those relationships over time, right? So we don't lose any knowledge about how the relationship was in the past. And it's also an important check essentially when we design a data vault. Can you go back to the previous state? So you change the state from one, let's say, employee to one corporate car. They change the corporate car, but then realize the corporate car is not good. You want to go back to your old car. And then can you go back to the previous state without losing the fact that you have been using the new corporate car, which was not good for a while? And that's the important piece here.
Yeah, absolutely. Wow. Well, I mean, this is the masterclass. It's really nice to hear you guys dive into these things. And Saqib, if you've got follow-ups, then you can certainly reach out to either Michael or Nols through email.